The bombardier's hand moved to the release lever. Below him, through the Norden bombsight's optics, a Japanese cruiser turned hard to starboard, cutting a white arc across dark water. At 23,000 feet, the air was thin enough to slow thought. The formation had already lost 2 aircraft. The cruiser's anti-aircraft batteries fired in coordinated salvos, and black bursts walked closer to the bomber's aluminum skin. The bombardier had seconds to decide. His training said the shot was impossible. A cruiser at flank speed, maneuvering under fire from this altitude with this wind. The mathematics didn't support it. But if he didn't release now, the formation would pass over the target, and the fuel reserves would not allow a second run. He adjusted the crosshairs 1 final degree. His thumb hovered. The cockpit smelled of oil and sweat. The pilot's voice came through the intercom, asking for status. The bombardier didn't answer. He was counting seconds, watching the cruiser's wake, calculating angles that existed only in his mind. To understand how he reached this moment, we must go back. In the spring of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces believed it had solved the problem of precision bombing. The Norden bombsight, a gyro-stabilized analog computer weighing 50 pounds, promised to deliver ordnance within 100 feet of a target from altitudes above 20,000 feet. The device calculated airspeed, altitude, drift, and ballistic trajectory in real time. It had been tested extensively over stationary targets in the Nevada desert and against slow-moving merchant vessels in controlled exercises. The results supported confidence. Training films showed bombardiers placing practice bombs inside painted circles on the ground. Instructors spoke of the device as if it removed human error from the equation. The mathematics were sound. The engineering was precise. But confidence rested on an assumption that would prove incomplete. The assumption was that naval targets, even warships, would behave predictably under attack. They would steam in straight lines or make gentle course corrections. They would not, the doctrine suggested, execute violent evasive maneuvers at speeds exceeding 30 knots, while simultaneously engaging aircraft with massed anti-aircraft fire. This assumption shaped training, tactics, and the expectations of crews deploying to the South Pacific. It also shaped Japanese defensive doctrine. Imperial Navy commanders believed that high-altitude level bombing posed minimal threat to fast combatants. They had observed early attacks in the Coral Sea and off Guadalcanal. American bombers released from altitudes that gave cruisers and destroyers ample time to observe the fall of bombs and turn away. The Japanese counted on speed and maneuverability as primary defenses. They allocated anti-aircraft ammunition accordingly, but did not expect to need it in overwhelming quantities. Their cruisers were designed to fight other surface ships. Anti-aircraft armament was secondary, added in small calibers to deter low-level attacks, but not concentrated enough to create an impenetrable barrier at high altitude. Both sides operated under frameworks that made sense given the evidence they possessed. But evidence gathered under one set of conditions does not always predict outcomes under another. The gap between expectation and reality remained invisible until someone crossed it. The bombardier who would challenge this thinking was trained at Deming Army Airfield in New Mexico. His name was Captain William Benn, though records from his unit list him in various documents as both pilot and bombardier, a reflection of the cross-training common in undermanned squadrons. Benn had logged 200 hours on the Norden site before deploying overseas. His instructors noted in his file that he demonstrated unusual patience during practice runs. Where other bombardiers grew frustrated with repeated misses and blamed equipment or wind, Benn reviewed his calculations methodically. He did not assume the bombsight was always correct. He tested its gyroscopes against known landmarks and corrected for drift manually when the device lagged. This was not intuition. It was a refusal to treat the machine as infallible. His approach came from experience in civil engineering before the war, where small errors in measurement compounded into structural failures. He had worked on bridge construction in Colorado, where wind loads and material tolerances had to be calculated with precision, or structures failed. He carried that discipline into the cockpit. Benn understood that systems, whether mechanical or tactical, had limits. The Norden bombsight was engineered for specific conditions. Outside those conditions, it provided guidance, not certainty. This perspective set him apart. Most bombardiers trusted the device completely. Benn trusted it conditionally. When Benn's squadron, the 43rd Bomb Group, arrived in New Guinea in February 1943, they were tasked with interdicting Japanese shipping along the northern coast. The targets were transports, tankers, and occasionally destroyers, moving supplies to isolated garrisons. The bombers flew from Port Moresby, across the Owen Stanley Range, and down over the Bismarck Sea. The missions were long, fuel margins were tight, and return options were limited. If an aircraft sustained damage or burned too much fuel repositioning for a second pass, ditching in the ocean became likely. Rescue prospects in those waters were poor. Japanese submarines patrolled the area. Allied air-sea rescue was limited to a handful of Catalina flying boats that could not operate safely in contested zones. This created pressure to make the first run count. It also meant that doctrine favoring multiple passes or coordinated attacks often gave way to single bomber solutions. The official mission plans included provisions for secondary runs, but pilots and bombardiers understood that fuel and enemy fire would rarely allow them. Benn adapted to this reality faster than most. He began calculating release points that assumed targets would turn, not that they would hold course. He started tracking patterns in how Japanese ships responded to bomber formations. Did they turn toward the threat or away? Did destroyers break formation or stay with their charges? Did cruisers increase speed immediately or wait until bombs were visible? These were small details, but they mattered. A ship turning away presented a longer profile. A ship turning toward required leading the target by a greater margin. Benn kept notes. His pilot thought he was wasting time. The other bombardiers in the squadron did not bother. But Benn understood that repetition revealed structure, and structure could be exploited. By early March, the 43rd Bomb Group had flown 16 missions against Japanese convoys. Results were mixed. Some transports had been sunk, but many more escaped. The bombers faced increasing anti-aircraft fire, suggesting the Japanese were learning to concentrate defenses. American casualties were mounting. 2 B-17s had been lost in the previous week. Morale in the squadron was steady, but not high. The crews understood they were grinding down the enemy's logistics, but individual missions often ended without clear success. Bombs fell into the ocean. Ships steamed away. The war continued. Then reconnaissance reported a major convoy moving south from Rabaul toward Leo. The size of the convoy indicated a significant reinforcement effort. Intelligence estimated at least 3,000 troops aboard the transports, along with ammunition, fuel, and provisions sufficient to sustain Japanese forces in the region for months. If the convoy reached Leh, Allied ground operations in New Guinea would face a fortified and resupplied enemy. If the convoy could be destroyed, those forces would be cut off. The stakes were clear. The order went out to commit every available bomber. The 43rd Bomb Group launched 13 B-17 Flying Fortresses in the early hours of March 4th. Benn flew as Bombardier in the lead aircraft. The plan was straightforward. The formation would approach from the south at 23,000 feet. beyond effective range of most anti-aircraft fire, and deliver a concentrated drop on the transports. The cruiser and destroyers were considered secondary. Doctrine held that fast warships were too difficult to hit from altitude, and that the transports represented the greater strategic value. This made sense on paper. Transports were slower, less maneuverable, and their destruction directly impacted Japanese operational capacity. Warships could be engaged later or avoided entirely. The mission brief emphasized the transports as primary targets. The cruiser was noted, but not prioritized. But this failed to account for what the cruiser would do once the bombers were overhead. The convoy consisted of 8 transports arranged in 2 columns, flanked by 8 destroyers in a screening pattern, and led by the light cruiser, Yubari. The cruiser was small by capital ship standards, displacing 2,900 tons with a length of just over 400 feet. It carried 6 5-inch main guns and multiple anti-aircraft mounts, including both 25mm machine guns and heavier dual-purpose batteries. The Yubari was older, commissioned in 1923, but it had been refitted multiple times and remained effective. Its primary role in the convoy was not to engage surface threats, but to coordinate air defense. The cruiser's radar, while less advanced than American systems, could detect formations at range and direct defensive fire. Its speed, 35 knots at maximum, allowed it to position itself between bombers and transports. The Japanese convoy commander had placed the Yubari at the head of the formation specifically for this purpose. If American bombers appeared, the cruiser would maneuver to draw their attention while the transports scattered. This was sound tactical thinking. A cruiser was harder to sink than a transport, and its loss, while significant, would not compromise the mission as directly. The commander was following doctrine, but doctrine assumed bombers would target what appeared most valuable. It did not account for a bombardier who understood that removing the escort was the faster path to destroying the convoy. As the formation approached, the convoy began evasive maneuvers. The transports turned in sequence, creating separation. This was standard procedure, designed to prevent a single bombing run from hitting multiple ships. The destroyers accelerated and began weaving, generating wakes that made their positions harder to predict. The cruiser Yubari increased speed to 32 knots and started a zigzag pattern with course changes every 40 seconds. At the same time, every anti-aircraft gun in the convoy opened fire. The sky filled with black bursts, each detonation leaving a sphere of smoke and shrapnel. The formations' tight grouping, designed to concentrate bombs on a single target, now became a liability. Each bomber had to hold course and altitude during the bomb run, making them predictable. The Japanese gunners adjusted their aim based on the formation's vector. Bursts began appearing directly in the flight path. 2 B-17s took hits before reaching the release point. One lost an engine and fell out of formation trailing smoke. The crew radioed that they were attempting to reach friendly territory, but the aircraft was losing altitude. It would not make it. The second bomber took shrapnel through the fuselage. The damage was less severe, but the pilot reported injuries among the crew and stated he was aborting. The formation continued. The bombardiers in the remaining aircraft released over the transports. Most bombs fell into empty water. The transports, having turned and accelerated, were no longer where the bomb sights predicted. 3 transports took near misses that caused flooding but did not sink them. One bomb struck a transport amidships, but the explosion failed to penetrate below the waterline. The ship slowed but remained afloat. The mission, by its stated objective, had failed. The formation began its turn for home, but Benn had not released his bombs. He had watched the cruiser, while the other bombardiers focused on the transports as briefed. Benn tracked the Yubari's movement through the Norden site. He noticed that its zigzag pattern, while appearing random, followed a timing structure. The cruiser turned hard every 40 seconds, alternating direction. Port, then starboard, then port again. Each turn was sharp, nearly 30 degrees off base course. The straightening between turns lasted approximately 10 seconds. Then the cycle repeated. This was not random evasion. It was a doctrine-driven response, likely trained into every Japanese cruiser captain as a counter to torpedo attacks. Submarines required time to calculate firing solutions. A zigzagging target with predictable timing could be avoided by firing into the predicted path. But that same predictability created vulnerability against an attacker who could calculate faster. Benn realized that if he could predict the timing of the next turn, he could calculate a release point that placed bombs not where the cruiser was, but where it would be when the bombs arrived. The math was tight. From 23,000 feet, bombs fell for approximately 30 seconds, accounting for air resistance and terminal velocity. If he released at the apex of the cruiser's turn, and if the cruiser followed its pattern, the bombs would intersect the ship's position midway through its return to base course. But this required releasing early, before the bomb sight indicated a solution. It required ignoring the machine. Benn's pilot, seeing that the formation had already dropped, asked if they should turn for home. Fuel was now a concern. The mission had taken longer than planned due to heavier headwinds on approach. Every minute over the target reduced their margin. Benn said no. He needed one more pass. The pilot hesitated, then agreed. He brought the aircraft around in a wide turn, descending slightly to build speed. The other bombers in the formation had already turned away. Benn's aircraft was now alone over the convoy. Every gun focused on them. The anti-aircraft fire intensified. Bursts appeared in clusters, close enough that the aircraft shook from the concussions. The tail gunner reported tracers passing just below the fuselage. The pilot asked again if Benn was ready. Benn said wait. He adjusted the sight manually, calculating wind drift and the cruiser's speed by eye. The Norden could not account for what he was attempting. The device required a steady target vector. The cruiser's zigzag invalidated that requirement. Benn had to calculate intercept geometry without the machine's assistance. He used the sight's optics to measure the cruiser's turn radius and timed the intervals with his watch. 40 seconds, 41, 39. Close enough to call it 40. He estimated the cruiser's speed at 30 knots, based on the length of its wake. He factored in wind speed, measured earlier during the approach, at 15 knots from the east. He calculated the bomb's fall time at 32 seconds, slightly longer than standard, due to the thinner air at altitude. He combined these variables into a mental model of where the cruiser would be in 32 seconds. The model was not precise. It could not be, but it was close enough to matter. He watched the Yubari complete a turn to port and begin its straightening. He counted seconds. At 18 seconds into the straightening, he released. The moment the bombs left the bay, the pilot immediately banked hard to starboard and descended. They needed distance from the target, and they needed it fast. The bombs fell in a tight cluster, 5 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs spaced by fractions of a second. The ballistic trajectories were nearly parallel. The crew did not see the impact. They were descending and turning to avoid the anti-aircraft fire that now concentrated on their isolated aircraft. The radio operator watched through a side window, but reported only that the bombs were falling toward the convoy. He could not confirm a hit. They would not know if the effort succeeded until they returned to base and reviewed reconnaissance reports. But other crews saw it. The bombs fell in a pattern that appeared to observers in other aircraft to be leading the cruiser by a significant margin. One pilot later reported that he thought the Bombardier had miscalculated badly. The bombs seemed to be falling into empty ocean ahead of the cruiser's bow. But the Yubari, completing its straightening phase, accelerated back toward its base course. The ship's momentum carried it forward. The bombs continued to fall. The intersection occurred at an altitude of 0. 2,000-pound bombs struck the cruiser amidships. The first hit just aft of the forward turret, penetrating the deck and detonating inside the upper hull structure. The explosion tore through crew compartments and ruptured steam lines. The second bomb struck at the waterline near the engine room, slightly offset to starboard. This bomb penetrated below the deck and detonated inside the engineering spaces. The combined force of both explosions severed structural frames and ruptured fuel bunkers. The cruiser's hull, designed to resist shell fire from the side, was not reinforced against downward impact. Naval armor doctrine prioritized lateral protection because surface engagements occurred horizontally. Deck armor was thinner, intended primarily to resist splinters and fragments from near misses. A 2,000-pound bomb detonating inside the hull exceeded the structure's capacity to absorb the force. The cruiser did not sink immediately. It lost power and began listing to starboard. Fires spread through the midship compartments, fed by ruptured fuel lines. The forward section remained structurally intact, but the engineering spaces were destroyed. Without power, the cruiser could not maintain speed or maneuver. It began to slow. The list increased. Within 3 minutes, the angle reached 15 degrees. Crew members abandoned their stations and moved toward the weather decks. Some attempted to fight the fires, but without power for pumps, their efforts were limited. The destroyers moved to assist. 2 destroyers approached from aft, intending to take the cruiser under tow or evacuate crew. But the damage was progressing faster than they anticipated. The fires reached a magazine. A secondary explosion blew out the port side amidships, and the list accelerated. At 11 minutes after the initial impact, the Yubari capsized. It rolled completely, presenting its keel, and then slipped beneath the surface. 319 men were lost. Some were trapped inside the hull. Others went into the water, but were pulled down by suction as the ship sank. The destroyers rescued 147 survivors. The remaining crew were never recovered. The loss of the cruiser changed the tactical situation immediately. The transports, now without their primary anti-aircraft screen, became vulnerable. The convoy commander ordered the transports to scatter and make independently for Leh at maximum speed. The destroyers attempted to provide coverage, but 8 destroyers could not create the same defensive envelope that the cruiser had coordinated. American aircraft returned the following day. Additional bomber formations, along with patrol torpedo boats operating from forward bases, engaged the scattered convoy over a period of 48 hours. Without centralized air defense, the attacks were more effective. All 8 transports were sunk. 4 destroyers were also destroyed. The remaining 4 destroyers, damaged and low on fuel, retreated toward Rabaul. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it became known, resulted in the loss of nearly 3,000 Japanese troops and eliminated an entire reinforcement convoy. Japanese operations in New Guinea were crippled. The planned offensive at Leh was canceled. Allied forces gained the initiative, but within military planning circles, attention focused less on the overall battle and more on the single hit that destroyed the cruiser. Benn's bomb run was analyzed in detail. Reconnaissance photos were cross-referenced with the bomber's position data and the cruiser's observed course. Analysts confirmed that the release had occurred 18 seconds before the bombsight's calculated solution. They noted that the bombs had been released while the cruiser was still straightening from a turn, not during a stable phase. This violated standard procedure. The Norden bombsight was designed to calculate solutions during stable target movement. Releasing during a transition phase introduced variables the device could not model. According to doctrine, the shot should not have worked, but it had. The question became whether it was reproducible. The Army Air Forces convened a technical review board at Wright Field in Ohio. Benn was recalled from the theater and debriefed over a period of 5 days. He provided mission notes, calculations, and a detailed reconstruction of his decision process. He explained how he had observed the cruiser's evasion pattern during approach and recognized its cyclical nature. He described how he had timed the intervals and estimated the ship's speed. He walked the board through his manual calculations, showing how he had factored wind drift, bomb fall time, and the cruiser's predicted position. He demonstrated the technique using simulation data, working through hypothetical scenarios with different ship speeds and evasion patterns. The board included bombing instructors, Norden technicians, and Navy observers. The Navy representatives were particularly interested. If bombardiers could reliably target maneuvering warships, the strategic calculus of naval engagements shifted. Carriers and battleships, previously considered safe from high-altitude bombing, would need additional protection. The board tested Benn's method using controlled exercises. Bombardiers were given target data for maneuvering ships and asked to calculate intercept points manually. Results were mixed. Experienced bombardiers who understood the underlying mathematics could reproduce Benn's approach with some reliability. Less experienced bombardiers struggled. The method required spatial reasoning, timing precision, and the confidence to override both training and equipment. Most bombardiers, trained to trust the Norden absolutely, found it difficult to set the device aside. The board concluded that the method was sound but difficult. It required bombardiers to override their training and trust manual calculations under combat stress. Most would not, but some could. The board recommended that the technique be taught as an advanced skill, not as standard procedure. Bombardiers would receive instruction on manual intercept calculations, but would not be required to demonstrate proficiency. The emphasis remained on the Norden for standard operations. Benn's method would be reserved for high-value targets where conditions justified the risk. The findings were distributed as a classified supplement to bombing doctrine. Sections on naval targets were revised. Bombardiers were instructed to observe evasive patterns during approach and consider manual release if the pattern appeared cyclical. The Norden bombsight, while still the primary tool, was now described as one input among several. The supplement included diagrams showing how to estimate ship speed from wake length, how to measure turn radius using the bombsight's optics, and how to calculate intercept geometry without computational assistance. It also included a section on risk assessment, emphasizing that manual calculation increased the chance of catastrophic error. A miscalculation could result in bombs falling miles from the target, wasting ordnance and exposing the bomber to prolonged anti-aircraft fire. The decision to use the technique was left to individual bombardiers, but they were cautioned to employ it only when standard methods were clearly insufficient. This was a significant doctrinal shift. It acknowledged that human judgment, under certain conditions, could exceed machine precision. This contradicted the narrative that had surrounded the Norden since its introduction. The device had been marketed as removing human variability from bombing. Crews had been told that if they followed procedure, accuracy was guaranteed. The revised doctrine admitted that this was not always true. Conditions in combat diverged from conditions in testing. Equipment performed differently under stress. Human operators had to adapt. The shift was subtle but important. It moved bombing doctrine away from rigid adherence to procedure and toward flexible decision-making. This would influence not only bombing operations, but broader military thinking about the relationship between technology and human operators. The Japanese response was slower, but more sweeping. After the loss of the Yubari and the subsequent destruction of the Convoy, the Imperial Navy reviewed its anti-aircraft and evasion protocols. The review identified two failures. First, the standard zigzag pattern, effective against submarines and surface threats, created predictable timing windows for aircraft equipped with advanced bomb sights. The review board noted that the 40-second cycle, while based on sound reasoning for anti-submarine work, was too regular. An observer with sufficient time could recognize the pattern and calculate intercepts. The board recommended randomizing evasion intervals, with turn timing varying between 20 and 90 seconds. This would prevent attackers from predicting ship positions, but it would also increase fuel consumption and reduce average convoy speed, complicating logistics. The Navy accepted the trade-off. Second, the assumption that high-altitude bombers could not hit maneuvering ships had led to inadequate anti-aircraft coverage. Japanese cruisers typically carried between 4 and 8 dedicated anti-aircraft guns, supplemented by dual-purpose main batteries that could engage aircraft when not firing at surface targets. This was insufficient against formations of a dozen or more bombers. The review board recommended increasing anti-aircraft armament on all cruisers and large destroyers, prioritizing rapid-fire weapons that could saturate a volume of sky rather than attempting precise targeting. The Navy issued new guidance. Cruisers operating in contested waters were to increase anti-aircraft armament, even at the cost of reducing secondary batteries or removing other equipment. Ships returning to port for refit were to have additional mounts installed. New construction would incorporate heavier anti-aircraft suites from the design phase. Evasive maneuvers were to be randomized, with turn intervals varying, and base course changes introduced unpredictably. Convoys were to disperse more widely during air attack, preventing bombers from concentrating on a single escort. Smoke generators were to be employed more aggressively, creating visual barriers that complicated targeting. These changes took time to implement. Shipyards were already strained by construction and repair schedules. Adding anti-aircraft guns required space and weight compensation. Some ships had to have torpedo tubes removed to balance the additions. Randomized evasion required more fuel and reduced overall convoy speed, forcing logistic planners to adjust supply schedules. Smoke generators consumed resources and required crew training, but the changes were made. The loss of the Yubari and the destruction of the Convoy had demonstrated that existing doctrine was insufficient. Adaptation was necessary. By late 1943, American bomber crews reported that Japanese warships had become noticeably harder to target. Hit rates declined. Ships no longer followed predictable evasion patterns. Anti-aircraft fire was heavier and more concentrated. Convoys dispersed more quickly when attacked, forcing bombers to engage isolated targets rather than massed formations. The tactical advantage that Benn's technique had revealed began to erode, but the window it had opened remained significant. Between March and August 1943, American bombers sank or damaged 17 Japanese warships using variations of the manual intercept method. Not all bombardiers succeeded. Some attempts resulted in complete misses, but enough succeeded to validate the approach. The Japanese adapted, and the Americans adapted to the adaptation. This cycle continued throughout the war. Neither side achieved a permanent advantage. Each innovation prompted a counter-innovation. The interaction between bomber and ship was not static. It was adaptive. Each side learned. Each side adjusted. The advantage went to whoever adapted faster. This dynamic extended beyond bombing doctrine. It shaped submarine tactics, radar development, fighter escort procedures, and countless other aspects of naval warfare. The principle remained constant. Recognize patterns. Exploit them. Expect the enemy to recognize and adjust. Plan the next move accordingly. Benn flew 11 more missions before his rotation ended in August 1943. He attempted the manual intercept technique twice more. The first attempt missed. The target destroyer turned earlier than predicted, and the bombs fell harmlessly astern. The second attempt resulted in a near miss that damaged a transport enough to force it to beach on a nearby island. Benn did not achieve another direct hit. He did not expect to. He understood that the conditions required for the technique were rare. The target had to follow a predictable pattern. The Bombardier had to have time to observe and calculate. The bomber had to survive long enough to make the attempt. All three conditions had aligned over the Bismarck Sea. They did not align again. Benn returned to the United States and spent the remainder of the war training bombardiers at bases in Kansas and Texas. He taught the technique he had used, though he was careful to emphasize that it was not a replacement for standard procedures. It was a tool for rare circumstances when doctrine did not fit conditions. Some of his students went on to employ the method in combat. Records indicate at least 6 successful intercept hits attributed to bombardiers Benn had trained. He did not take credit for these. He considered them independent applications of a logical principle. After the war, he left the service and returned to civil engineering. He worked on dam construction projects in the Pacific Northwest and later taught structural engineering at a university in Oregon. He did not speak publicly about the mission until the 1970s, when a historian researching the Battle of the Bismarck Sea contacted him. By then, the details had been declassified. Benn provided his mission notes and calculations, which are now held in the National Archives. He answered questions but did not embellish. He described the mission in factual terms, focusing on the technical aspects rather than the emotional experience. When asked if he felt fear during the bomb run, he said he had been too focused on the calculations to notice. When asked if he felt pride in the result, he said he felt relieved that the effort had not been wasted. He died in 1994, at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his service, but did not describe the cruiser. The Norden bombsight remained in use through the end of the war, but its reputation shifted. It was no longer considered a guarantee of precision. Post-war analysis showed that bombing accuracy under combat conditions averaged far below peacetime test results. The device performed well in stable conditions with trained operators, but combat introduced variables that degraded performance. Weather obscured targets. Anti-aircraft fire forced evasive maneuvers that disrupted the sight's gyroscopes. Crew fatigue reduced concentration. Targets moved unpredictably. The bombsight was a tool, not a solution. This understanding influenced the development of guided munitions in the decades that followed. The idea that a weapon system could account for all variables automatically gave way to designs that kept human operators in the decision loop. Precision required both machine capability and human judgment. The balance between the two became a central question in weapons design. It remains so. Modern precision-guided munitions incorporate sensors and processors far more advanced than the Norden, but they still allow operators to override guidance when conditions warrant. The principle Benn demonstrated, that human judgment can exceed machine precision under certain circumstances, persists in doctrine and technology. The systems are different. The principle is the same. The wreck of the Yubari was located in 2008 by a deep-sea survey team operating off the coast of New Guinea. The hull rests at a depth of 1,800 feet, broken into 3 sections. The breakpoints correspond to the locations where Benn's bombs struck and where the secondary magazine explosion occurred. The midship area is collapsed inward, consistent with internal detonation. The bow section lies upright, partially buried in sediment. The stern section rests, inverted approximately 200 feet from the main wreckage. Corrosion has obscured much of the detail, but the fracture pattern is consistent with catastrophic structural failure. The site is considered a war grave under international maritime law. No salvage has been attempted. The wreckage is monitored periodically to assess deterioration, but it is otherwise undisturbed. The men lost aboard are remembered in Japan at the Yasukuni Shrine and in smaller memorials in the towns from which they came. Their families received notification months after the sinking, as communication from the theater was slow. Some families did not learn the details until after the war ended. The records indicate that most of the crew were young, with an average age of 23. Many were conscripts from rural prefectures, assigned to the Navy through the national draft system. They had limited naval training and were still learning their duties when the ship went down. The officers were more experienced, but experience provided little advantage when the ship lost structural integrity. Survival depended on proximity to exits and the ability to reach the weather deck before the ship capsized. Those trapped below had no chance. The broader lesson of the event extends beyond tactics. It speaks to the limits of prediction in combat. Both the United States and Japan entered the engagement with models of how high-altitude bombing and naval evasion would interact. Both models were based on sound reasoning and available evidence. Both were incomplete. The gap between model and reality was closed not by institutional adaptation, but by an individual who recognized that his tools were insufficient and chose to act anyway. This is not a story about heroism in the traditional sense. Benn did not charge into danger. He did not rally men or sacrifice himself. He made a mathematical decision under pressure, and it worked. The decision required technical skill, observational discipline, and the willingness to discard doctrine when it conflicted with observed reality. These qualities are not distributed evenly. Most people, faced with the same circumstances, would have followed procedure. They would have trusted the machine. They would have returned to base, having expended their ordnance without result. Benn did not. Whether this reflects superior judgment or simply a different set of priorities is difficult to determine. What is clear is that his decision, multiplied across thousands of similar moments throughout the war, shaped outcomes more than any single grand strategy. Wars are not won by doctrine alone. They are won by people who know when to follow doctrine and when to set it aside. The tactical implications of the Bismarck Sea engagement extended into post-war military education. The incident became a case study in service academies and staff colleges. It was used to illustrate the importance of adaptive thinking, the limits of technological determinism, and the role of individual initiative in complex operations. Students analyzed Benn's decision process, debating whether his actions represented sound judgment or excessive risk. Some argued that he had violated procedure and endangered his crew by remaining over the target after the formation withdrew. Others argued that his assessment of the tactical situation justified the deviation. The debates were useful, not because they reached consensus, but because they forced students to think critically about when rules should be followed and when they should be questioned. The case study appeared in various forms across multiple decades. Early versions focused on the technical aspects of the bombing solution. Later versions incorporated broader questions about decision-making under uncertainty. By the 1980s, the case was being used in business schools as an example of adaptive strategy in competitive environments. The details changed with each retelling, but the core lesson remained. Success often requires recognizing when established methods are insufficient and improvising alternatives based on available information. This is easier said than done. Doctrine exists for reasons. It codifies lessons learned through experience. It provides structure in chaotic situations. Abandoning doctrine without good cause leads to failure more often than success. But adhering to doctrine when it clearly does not fit conditions leads to failure as well. The skill lies in distinguishing between the two. Benn possessed that skill. Whether it can be taught remains an open question. The human cost of the engagement is sometimes overlooked in tactical analyses. 319 Japanese sailors died aboard the Yubari. The American bomber that was shot down during the initial approach crashed into the sea with no survivors, killing 10 crew members. The damaged bomber that attempted to return to base ditched short of the coast. 3 crew members survived and were later rescued. 7 did not. In the broader battle, Japanese casualties exceeded 4,000 when transport crews and embarked troops are included. American casualties totaled 13 killed and 5 wounded. These numbers are presented in after-action reports without elaboration. They represent decisions, errors, successes, and failures, compressed into a few lines of text. Each number was a person with a life that preceded the war and a future that was erased. The men aboard the Yubari did not choose to be there. They were following orders, executing doctrine, and attempting to protect the convoy as trained. Their deaths resulted from decisions made by commanders they never met, in response to strategic pressures they did not fully understand. This is true of most casualties in war. Individual actions matter, but they occur within structures that constrain choice. Benn made a decision that killed 319 men. He did so in service of a strategy designed to kill many more. Whether this was justified depends on frameworks of evaluation that extend beyond tactics. The families of the men lost aboard the Yubari would likely view the event differently than the strategists who praised Benn's innovation. Both perspectives are valid. Both are incomplete. War does not resolve these tensions. It creates them and then moves on.